Welcome to the channel. Don't forget to subscribe. It will be interesting. And we begin.
Story 1. The Disappearing Neighbor. I've always believed that life in a quiet neighborhood was predictable. You wake up, go about your daily routine, greet the same people, and feel a sense of security in knowing what to expect. But what happened with my neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, changed the way I see the world forever. I moved into my house about 5 years ago, in what I thought was the perfect neighborhood. It was a small cul-de-sac on the outskirts of town, lined with older houses, the kind that carried a sense of nostalgia. Across the street lived Mrs. Evelyn Thompson, a widow in her 70s. She was one of those old-fashioned types, always in a dress, always tending to her garden. Every morning at 7 a.m. sharp, she would take out her garbage, and every evening, she would sit on her porch with a cup of tea, watching the sunset. She was, in many ways, a fixture of the neighborhood, until she wasn't. It started with a small, nagging feeling. One morning, I noticed her trash bins weren't out. At first, I shrugged it off, maybe she had forgotten. But the next day, they still weren't there. That's when I began to feel something was off. I knocked on her door later that afternoon. No answer. Her curtains were drawn, which was unusual. She always kept them open during the day to let the sunlight in. That's when I saw it, the newspapers. 3 of them, stacked on her doorstep, untouched. My stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. I tried knocking again, harder this time. No response. I even called out her name, but the silence inside the house was suffocating. I decided to check with another neighbor, Mr. Hendricks, who had lived in the area for over 20 years. He was an old man who spent most of his time on his porch, watching the neighborhood like a hawk. "Mr. Hendricks, have you seen Mrs. Thompson lately?" I asked. His face darkened. "Not for a few days." "Why?" "Her newspapers are piling up, and she hasn't taken out her trash." I knocked, but no one answered. He frowned, shifting uncomfortably. "That's odd. She's never missed a trash day in the last 15 years. That was enough for me to call the police. I wasn't trying to be nosy, but something didn't sit right. An officer arrived later that evening. He knocked a few times before deciding to check the door. It was unlocked. When we stepped inside, I felt an immediate chill. The air was stale, as if the house had been undisturbed for days. The living room looked perfectly normal. No signs of a struggle, no mess, nothing out of place. The teacup she usually drank from was sitting on the table, the tea inside now a dark, dried-up stain at the bottom. We moved deeper into the house, calling her name, but the silence was deafening. Her bedroom was untouched, the bed neatly made. The only strange thing was that all her shoes were still lined up by the door. If she had left, she had done so barefoot. The officer checked the back door. It was locked from the inside. Every window in the house was locked. There were no signs of forced entry or foul play. It was as if she had simply vanished. The police launched an investigation, but nothing turned up. No witnesses, no leads, no financial transactions after her disappearance. It was like she had never existed. The worst part, a few weeks later, a young couple moved into her house. The police deemed the case unsolved, and life went on. But not for me. One night, unable to sleep, I sat on my porch, staring at her old house, now freshly painted, the porch lights replaced, the garden dug up and replanted by the new owners. Everything had changed, except for one thing: the rocking chair. Mrs. Thompson had an old wooden rocking chair that she used to sit in every evening. The new owners had left it there, a relic of the past. But as I sat there that night, watching the house in the dim glow of the streetlight, I saw it move. Just a little. Just enough to send a chill down my spine. And I swear, in the quiet of the night, I heard a voice whisper, soft, distant, and familiar. I never left. Mrs. Thompson was gone, but something told me she was still there, watching, waiting. Story 2. The Midnight Visitor. It all started the night I moved into my new apartment. It wasn't much, just a small studio in an older building on the quiet side of town. The rent was cheap, and for someone who had just landed a new job, it was perfect. But from the first night, I knew something was off. That first evening, after unpacking most of my things, I collapsed onto my bed, exhausted. The street below was silent, apart from the occasional passing car. I was about to drift off when I heard it. A knock. Not at my front door, but at my bedroom door. I lived alone. My pulse quickened. I told myself I had imagined it, that it was the house settling, or a sound from another apartment. I stayed still, listening. Nothing. The next night, it happened again. 3 soft knocks, right at my bedroom door. I sat up, heart pounding. The door was closed. I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming it at the door. No shadows, no signs of movement. After a few minutes, I worked up the courage to get out of bed and check the apartment. The front door was locked. The windows were shut. No one was there. I barely slept that night. By the end of the first week, I was exhausted. The knocking continued every single night, always around 3 a.m. Never more than 3 knocks. Never any voices or footsteps. I told myself it had to be something logical. Pipes in the walls. Maybe a prank from someone in the building. I mentioned it casually to my landlord, who simply frowned. No one's lived in that unit for long, he said. People always break their lease early. That didn't make me feel any better. One night, after another round of knocking, I decided I had had enough. I grabbed a chair, wedged it under the bedroom door handle, and climbed back into bed. I told myself that whatever was happening, it couldn't get in. That night, I didn't wake up to knocking. I woke up to breathing, right next to my ear. I jumped up, turning on the light. The room was empty. The chair was still in place, but the air was heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. I started looking into the history of the building. I found an old newspaper article about a woman who had lived in my apartment years ago. She had been found dead in her bedroom. The police ruled it a natural death, but neighbors reported hearing knocking at her door the night before she died. I moved out the next day. Sometimes late at night, I wake up thinking I hear it again. 3 soft knocks, right at my bedroom door. And I wonder what would have happened if I had ever opened it. The man in the attic. It started with little things. A misplaced coffee mug. A door that I was sure I had closed, left ajar. I lived alone in a small house in the suburbs, so I brushed it off as forgetfulness. But then the noises started. At first, they were subtle. A faint creak in the middle of the night. A rustling sound, almost like fabric shifting against wood. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just the wind or the old house settling. But the sounds grew louder, more distinct. One night, I woke up to what sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate, above me. I didn't have an attic, or so I thought. The next morning, I searched the house more carefully. I checked every corner, every closet, every possible space where someone or something could be hiding. Everything seemed normal until I noticed a small panel in my hallway ceiling. It was slightly ajar, just enough to be noticeable now that I was looking for something out of place. My stomach twisted. Could someone be living up there? That evening, I called my friend Eric to come over. I wasn't about to check it alone. Together, we grabbed a ladder and cautiously pushed the panel open. The air that rushed down was stale, thick with dust and something else, something rotten. I shone a flashlight inside and froze. There was a small sleeping area, a thin mattress covered in a tattered blanket, food wrappers and empty water bottles scattered around. A tattered backpack lay in a corner, partially open, revealing some old clothes and a journal with frayed pages. A sinking feeling settled in my gut. Someone had been living here. Eric whispered, "Jesus, how long do you think?" Before he could finish, we heard a noise, a scraping sound coming from deeper in the crawl space. My heart nearly stopped. I quickly aimed the flashlight in the direction of the sound, but the space seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness. The police arrived within minutes. They searched the attic thoroughly, but found no one. They estimated that whoever had been staying there had been living in my attic for weeks, maybe months. The thought made my skin crawl. The officers took the backpack and the journal as evidence. I asked if I could see what was written inside. One of them hesitated, but eventually handed it over after flipping through the pages. The entries were disturbing. I watch him when he sleeps. He never locks the bathroom window. Easy way in. He looks nervous tonight. Maybe he knows. My blood ran cold. Someone had been watching me, studying me, planning something. The police assured me they would investigate further, but I didn't sleep that night. I replaced the locks on my doors and windows immediately. I installed security cameras. I never heard the noises again, but every now and then I catch myself glancing up at the ceiling, wondering if he ever came back.
Thanks for watching and listening. Don't forget to subscribe.